Hello, Mia.
Hello, Dr. Boswell.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome to Sermon Talkback. Hello to everybody online. If you want to turn around and, wave to the people on the camera who are watching us at Southminster and Matthews Glen. Is that
Matthews Glen,
Matthews Glen? Others who are watching from home, we do appreciate you and we honor you. If you have a question, send it to me on email, and I will be checking my email throughout this conversation so that we can work your question into the chat. All right, first of all, Ben and Matt is somewhere. First of all, this Fiddler on the Roof song, y'all got me with that one.
Oh,
That's
man,
one of my.
it's so good.
I was like, okay.
You didn't see it coming, did you?
I didn't. I read the order of worship, yesterday, and I was like,
It's one thing to see it in print, and then to hear it. It's just so. It's an amazing
I forgot about
piece
that.
of music.
I forgot about it. It's a great. I'm a musical theater dork, so anything musical theater is great.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting how musical theater lends itself to worship in a lot of fun ways.
It does.
Yeah.
Yes. So let's jump into these questions. Oh,
you can't. Can anybody hear me? Are they? Okay. All right. Just make sure folks can hear me. Good.
Oh,
Me
I'm
is
sorry.
loud.
Yes.
Okay. Good.
Wes tells me this all the time. Sorry, Wes.
Don't eat the mic, Mia.
All righty. So we have two different questions that are basically the same, so I'm going to read them both. They're from two different people. Mm-hmm. What traditions do we hold as a church? What traditions do we as a church hold on to that prevent us from being fully inclusive? Mm. And the other one is, what traditions are MPBC trying to hold on to that are hindering our growth and development? Can we remain relevant if we don't give up these traditions? So they're similar.
Oof. Heavy questions. Good questions, though. I want to start by saying I don't have the answer to all that, because as a community of faith, we have to discern that together. That's our common work, not just the work of the staff. It is the work of the body to determine and see that. Now, I will say one of the things that makes that challenging is the longer you've been here, the harder it is to see what traditions are impacting inclusivity. It's because they just become a part of the architecture and the pattern of this place and who we are. So, it can be something very, very small, or it could be something very, very big, many of which we're already trying to press up against, not without some resistance, of course, but to try to push a little bit to see, okay, what's really behind this tradition? Where did it come from? Why is it here? How valuable is it? Does it continue to help people feel included, or is it a barrier? You'll remember we had a strategic plan. We still have a strategic plan, for those who haven't read it in a while, that we are working to implement. And one of the things in that strategic plan was particularly around barriers to worship. What were the barriers that were making it hard for people to worship? This is an intimidating place, our church, for a lot of reasons. One is because it's in Myers Park. That's the first intimidating factor that we have to wrestle with. Second, it is very large. Every time I have a friend come by and drive around the church and say, I went to your church, it's massive. The size itself is imposing, right, on people who would come for the first time. Then you add to that, if there's any knowledge of our reputation that you might receive in the community, people are coming with preconceived notions. And we've noticed that they're intimidated by that. They're almost afraid sometimes, not even sure they want to come check it out because of all that we are. And we can't overcome all of that in one fell swoop, but we can try. So simple things we've tried to do, like to make the building look more welcoming with signage that's colorful and engaging and modern, to liven up and brighten front entrances. The campaign, the inclusivity campaign that we've been on, that was interrupted by COVID, trying to diversify music in worship, diversifying our staff, diversifying the kind of programming that we're offering. So we're trying to do what we can. I will say this, one of the things we have going for us that we've always had is people who come to the church for the first time always tell me they felt welcomed by our people. Sometimes they'll say, I didn't know what to do about the pews. I didn't really, not so sure about the music. I don't know about the style of the sanctuary, et cetera, et cetera. But whenever they interact with people, right now, and at least for the past few years, what I'm hearing from them is they feel radically welcomed. I'll give you a story about this. Pico, whose daughter Sephi was dedicated today, Pico and his wife Caroline are both professors at Davidson University. Pico in sociology, Caroline in linguistics. They've only been attending for a while, and plus COVID, they've not been in the building a lot, even though they've been attending for a long time. So they're new members. A couple weeks ago, they were driving down, and they actually, I know Pico's going to be mad I told this story, but anyway, they were driving down to Myers Park, and they parked, and they walked into church, and they happened to go to Myers Park United Methodist, and not here. And they walked in, and Pico looks up, and he says, that doesn't look like my choir. And then he starts hearing people get up and speak, and he's like, that doesn't look like my people. And then suddenly, somebody comes up to him and says, can I help you? Can I help you? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Not a very welcoming question. It's kind of the question you would ask of someone you were suspicious about in the grocery store that you think might be stealing. Can I help you? He felt completely unwelcomed there. He said people started turning and staring at them, and they felt like this bodily sense of non-welcome, just like this exclusionary feeling. Immediately grabbed their stuff, came down to our church, come walking in, and he said they had a quandary when they walked in because so many families were moving in their pews and gesturing them to come. They didn't know who to go to because there were too many people trying to welcome them. The opposite of what they experienced at Myers Park Methodist, right? I say that to say, as members, as people, in our engagements with people, we're doing a great job. You all are welcoming people when they come. You're making them feel amazing about being here. However, we're fighting an uphill battle against church decline in America, against religious traditions, against having an older space that is built ornately with things that look different than people experience on a daily basis, especially if they've never grown up in church before. Music they may not have ever heard, pews, hymnals, etc., practices, traditions. So we have to try to make those more welcoming. One of the things that Carrie is helping work on, and Mia too, is our language. You'll read about this in the weekly coming up soon. Sometimes we use insider terms that make sense to us, but don't make sense to anybody else. One of those that we use is startup. Startup. If you're not a person in Myers Park, how would you know anything about what startup means? It means, what are we starting up? What exactly does it? And so there's some talk amongst Ministry of Community Life to change that to Welcome Week. Right, welcome back from summer, welcome week, we're getting started for the fall again. Just simple things like that. What is a ministry? Some people don't even know what we mean when you use the word ministry. They have ministries in the UK that are like the Ministry of Transportation. We don't have, that's not what we mean by ministry, right? How do we describe ourselves and what we're doing in language that is accessible to our folks that are coming to us from all over the place? Not just now from Catholic and Presbyterian and Episcopalian and Baptist and Jewish and atheist and agnostic and non-religious. Folks coming from, they've never been in church before in their whole lives. They don't know what ministry is. And then the language and the order of worship. What is an invocation? How do we describe these words in ways that people can understand what they are? Sometimes education can help, but people coming in for the first time, you can't educate somebody on their first day here. And people are making up their minds about whether they stay in a church in the first 15 seconds of their experience. So we've got some work to do to overcome that stuff, but it's a collective process, and we're hard at work at it all the time, trying to make sure we continue to be more welcoming. And so I'll also say just thank you all for continuing to welcome new people when they come with open arms.
Yes. Thank you, Ben. So this next question is, Thank you for moving my cheese, this person says.
I know
We're
that book.
referencing that book, Who Moved My Cheese? Good book. Thank you for moving my cheese with your sermon. In fact, you really pushed it out the door into the world. Interesting scriptures with a powerful response by Jesus. Can you speak to the problems churches face adapting to a new world these days, and doing so moving away from tradition? After all, traditions run deep within the church world, and change is not usually embraced fully.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I think one of the things that is hard for us is, particularly as people of faith, in our daily lives, in our lives out there in the world, we have figured out how to deal with radical change. You know, think about the experience in my lifetime, in my daughter's lifetime. There were no such things as smartphones when she was born, right? We're talking about things that have radically altered everything about our society, including human behavior. Like, we have addictions to them now, they're in our hands, we're always looking at them, we're touching it more than we touch anything else in our lives. That's a radical change in human behavior, in society, in culture, and we're just like, oh yeah, okay. Now, if I was to say to everybody in the church, to get in here, you have to hold something in your hand. You have to buy a new device. It would be anarchy. People would lose their minds. And that's just an illustration that the way in which we have become accustomed to the fact that in our daily lives, changes occur in technology, society, politics, all sorts of other things that we will have to adapt to, or we will become irrelevant immediately. We won't be able to do things. We won't be able to go to the store. We won't be able to, there's certain things you can't even do right now if you don't have an internet access, right? The world has changed. If you can't get online, there's lots of things you can't do anymore, right?
Like signing up for COVID vaccine.
Right, like even getting a COVID vaccine. Yeah, so it's just amazing how much our lives have changed just in my lifetime and my daughter's, and we've adapted. Now, it doesn't mean we didn't complain, but we adapted immediately. We did it. Now, in the church, we do not have the muscle stamina to understand ourselves changing in that way. We have not practiced it. You know, you think about 500 years is how, like the way the church goes and change, and the world is changing every 30 minutes. You know, and we think of things in terms of these huge swaths, the Reformation, right? The Middle Ages, you know, the American colonial period. These huge swaths of time. The reality is, if we continue to think that way about church, we will become completely irrelevant, and we will lose more things that we love than we can hold on to if we try not to change. And that's the thing that's so hard to help people understand, is that change is inevitable. We have a choice of what we hold on to and what we lose sometimes, if we're careful. But we are going to lose stuff. We're going to lose more stuff if we fight change entirely than if we just understand that change is coming. We're going to end up losing everything versus losing the things that we just can't hold on to anymore. And there's choices that have to be made, really hard choices about, you know, what can we bring with us into this new place we're going, and what do we have to leave behind. We have leaders who are helping us. That's what our elected leaders are doing in the church, trying to help us figure out what are those things and how to do those things. But we need the members to work on their muscle stamina with change in the church. I think what's also happening now is, regardless of how slow we wanted change to go, COVID accelerated change in this church in a way that we can't comprehend yet, because we're not fully back. And we're not having congregational meetings in person. We're not dwelling around hours and hours. Not everybody's back yet, even from the summer. So we're not having all the small group meetings we were once having. Things have changed, and in that time, people are now coming back, and so much change has happened in their lives rapidly. Many times we hope that the church will be the place that provides the stability and comfort in our lives in a world of radical change. But the church is in the world, not of the world, but in the world too, and it has to also figure out how to change in ways that make sense with who it is. You know, this is why that's why we have a mission statement, and that's why we have a strategic plan, so that we are intentionally changing in ways that the members of the body have decided. and not randomly and haphazardly based on the whims of the time. That's what the plan provides for us. You know, we had 300 people participate in listening circles that told us what they wanted the church to be 5 years ago. And then we have tried to implement those plans as best we could. And, you know, sometimes they were very wildly accepted. Sometimes they were very wildly opposed, you know, as would be anything. But without that plan, we're just going to change in random and crazy ways instead of a strategic and planned out way that we decided for ourselves. And so our real choices are not between change and no change. Our choice is between the change we chose for ourselves as a community and the random haphazard change that the world will force upon us. And we have to choose one over the other. And when people call us with their complaints and say, "Can you believe what they did over there at my church?" You know, et cetera, et cetera. I hear that stuff, you know. You got to say, they're trying to do what we told them to do. We told them where we wanted to go, and they're trying to take us. Otherwise, we're going to be over here just totally in chaos, changing in random ways that we did not choose for ourselves. There's enough chaos just trying to go the way we want to go. There's enough chaos in the world with declining church membership and COVID and politics and all the craziness of our society. We need to walk together on that plan, you know. So anyway, that's kind of my thought about. I'm not even sure I answered the question. Now, I was on a tangent.
You know, I think you did. I mean, a lot of these revolve around the same thing, so you'll get more into it.
Thank you, Mia. That was very graceful.
So to get into some nitty gritty, what is your process or our process for determining if a tradition is worth saving in a church setting or in life?
In life or in the church setting? So in the church setting, we are, the leaders, as best we can be, are trying to be guided by the strategic plan. And this is why we voted on that as a congregation. And it came from the voices of the members. You know, what do they say about if you don't have a plan, that's where you end up? You know, you end up where you end up nowhere if you don't have a plan. So anyway, we're trying to follow that plan. So that's really what guides us and helps make our decisions. You know, there's also always things that you just have to kind of do a gut check with. You know, is this really still vital to our membership? Is it still really moving people spiritually the way it once was? Is it really caring for our members the way it once was? So there's some thought process that has to go, and I want to make sure everybody understands that we don't change anything without talking about it over and over and over and over again. I used to like to joke that one of my favorite traditions of Myers Park is that we will beat things to death until people are so tired they're like, "Fine, change it," you know? That is one of our traditions. Dale Allison told me before I came here on staff during the search process that one of the mottos here was, if you throw away a bone, they organize a dog around it. So there's that's funny, but it's also true. There's a lot of that going on as well. And so, you know, I think that's part of church change, because we're not just a nonprofit organization. We're a whole body of believers, and we're trying to bring everybody along with us. We literally want everybody on the train going to the next station as we walk down this plan. But of course, we all have a destination, and if at some point somebody says, "I don't want to go there," then we got to have a conversation, you know, because the destination is the destination. You know, how we go there sometimes can change, but we do have a destination.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to combine a few of these questions that are, again, similar. Great sermon. In your opinion as a pastor, what traditions should be re-examined here? Another question, what traditions do we need to change to do the work that God is calling us to do in this decade? And then this person says, can change be a stillifying tradition? How do we recognize helpful change versus disruption for disruption's sake?
Yeah, I hear a lot let me start backwards and move forwards. I hear a lot of folks sometimes say, we can't just change for change's sake. Well, we're doing tradition for tradition's sake for 80 years. So why can't we just change for change's sake? That's the first thing. Let's make it even. We've been doing tradition for tradition's sake for a long time, so why can't we just change for change's sake from time to time? Let's free ourselves from having to have some kind of crazy reason, some kind of well laid out, articulate that takes us 10 months to prepare. Sometimes you just got to change things. It's just not working. If you're not adaptable as an organization, you will die. You have to be able to adapt. And you have to be able to do it more quickly than just like, let's take a 10-year study of this particular, let's take a 10-year study of the pews. No, that's crazy, They either work or they don't. It's like, there's some of that stuff we just get into long patterns on. So let me just say, no one seems to have a problem when we do tradition for tradition's sake. It's only when we do change for change's sake that people have a problem. So there's an unequal starting point of the conversation about both of them. However, we shouldn't just do change for change's sake. We do change always so that we can fulfill the mission that we have been called to do and be in the world better, more effectively. The mission we have called to do and be in the world is to be an inclusive community for spirituality and social justice. This is what we have decided together. We have a strategic plan that shows us how to do that over a 5 to 10 year period of time. Everything we change has to be changed in a way that will make us more inclusive, more community, better in spirituality, more in social justice. So everything we do fulfills the mission. So every change has to have the logic of making it easier for us to be able to fulfill our mission in the church and in the world. That's how we make decisions. That's how we think about change. We don't just want to cause disruption. Disruption sometimes is helpful, but it's usually not helpful. One thing about when you study capitalism, you will notice that capitalism at its heart is a disruptive economic system. It intentionally creates disruption so as to then stimulate economic growth, which is why things like catastrophes, like Katrina and other things, then become a swoop-in moment for all these capitalists to rebuild the city around a new capitalist model. So disruption, disaster, then poof. So we have in some ways to resist the onslaught of a neoliberal capitalist environment. Disruption is unhelpful in church, so long as what we're doing is living an alternative vision, right, from the status quo of the world around us, with some clarity around it. So I don't believe in disruption for disruption's sake. There's plenty of disruption in people's lives right now. There's enough chaos already in the world through COVID or whatever it is, changes politically, et cetera. And I think, we need some stability here, but our stability should be grounded not in the traditions around the mission, but in the mission itself. That's where the stability comes from, right? I hasten to say this because I know for some, this is Mecca, right? But imagine for a moment, just let's say we had a Great Depression again, which, by the way, is probably possible. But anyway, let's say we had that again, and we really just couldn't afford the building. Would we still be Myers Park Baptist Church? If the answer is no, there's a problem. If the answer is no, there's a problem. Because the church is not a building, it's a people, right? I don't want to sing nursery rhymes to you. But it is always a people. And it's a people on a mission, on a journey of faith together. That's who we are. And if we get too caught up in the architecture around it, literally and metaphorically, then we will lose sight of the mission. This is what I think Jesus was trying to say about the heart, and I was trying to zero in on this intentionally. If we love the tradition more than we love God and the mission that God has called us to, then our hearts are in the wrong place. We've put our hearts in the wrong place. And so we have to think about where our hearts are. Sometimes the conversations that when somebody calls you and says, I can't believe they put up those signs that say God loves transgender people all around my church, then the answer is, well, how is that out of step with the mission of who we are? Maybe their heart's in the wrong place. Maybe they just don't really love transgender people yet. Maybe they don't understand why we have to be so explicit in our love for transgender people. Maybe they don't understand the crises facing transgender people in our community. I'm just using that as an example. But some of the other traditions, someone mentioned the national environment. What are the traditions in the world? And the church, I know some people sometimes say, oh my God, Ben, here's another sermon on race, for instance. Haven't we heard about that enough? No. We will not hear about it enough in our lifetimes. We have 400 years of oppression in this country. We will never hear enough about race in our lifetimes. Right? We will never, ever hear enough about race in our lifetimes. And what we know, this is the other thing, we know that people who are Christian, who identify as Christian in America, are more racist than if you're not Christian. What does that mean? It means that the church, which created race and created whiteness, perpetuates racism in society, worse so than it does to alleviate it throughout the last 400 years. So that means that the church now, in this moment, if it is going to be followers of Jesus, who was clearly not racist, have to be about anti-racism all the time. Not as an aside, not balanced, not once in a while, all the time. There is no way to overcome 400 years of systemic oppression that comes from the church, that is based out of the church, without constantly working on it. It's not going to go away. I will be working on my own whiteness my whole life, till I die, and it's all I work on, it seems like sometimes. But that's how deep the problem is. The same is true of my patriarchal misogyny. The same is true of my homophobia. The same is true of all the stuff that got in me, in my heart, right, that comes out of my heart, as Jesus said, that comes out of my heart, that I have to keep working on for my whole life, to keep cultivating that inclination toward goodness and love and not evil. And there's not like a day where I can go, you know what, let's take a neutral day off and forget that there's an inclination to evil inside me and pretend that I'm just like a neutral human being in the world. No, that doesn't work. It's just that's part of spiritual disciplines. It's part of our prayer life. It's part of our work as a church. So I know there are some folks that, feel that sometimes we focus too much on social justice as a church, but I think there is a failure to understand how social justice and spirituality are the same thing. They're integrated together with one another. They come from the same place, and they are tied deeply to each other. You can't do one really without the other. They must be always mutually informing and tied together. And at the same time that we will always be, as a predominantly white church, we will always be having to work at least 80 years. Let's say that for ourselves. Let's at least take the next 80 years to work on race, if not 400, because that's how long it's going to take.
Do you think that the issue with the church in America is that we feel like we've arrived, or people feel like they've arrived? We've arrived. We've done a statement. We have our statement. We've arrived. We talked about this 20 years ago. Instead of the approach that language is changing. Even when I look at our statement from 2001 on gay and lesbian inclusion, it's outdated.
Right. That's
right? And so if we look at that statement as we've arrived, we did our thing 20, 30 years ago, we failed to keep up with the evolution, the change that has happened since we made that statement to say, let's go back and let's edit. So do you think the church has in general, many churches, especially progressive churches, have this feeling like, oh, we've arrived, we're open and affirming, we are inclusive, we've done that?
I had a mentor who once said that the greatest problem Southern Baptists ever had was that they were successful. We become arrogant about our success, and our church is no different. We have a tremendous history. Incredible things that this church did and stood for that nobody in town was even thinking about, wouldn't have touched with a 10-foot pole, would have been terrified from, couldn't even theologically describe for themselves, let alone try to get out there on, for the most part. And if we rest on that legacy, we atrophy our muscles, and we get so far behind, then I give a sermon and somebody has a bad day because of something I said. If we had made it, then nothing I, as a white man, could ever say would make anybody in this congregation have a bad day. If we had made it. If we had made it. When Dr. Barber came here, we wouldn't have had to have 3 months of deacons meetings to settle people down. If we had made it. If we had made it, I wouldn't get some emails that I get about don't talk about racial justice anymore, take down the Black Lives Matter sign, you know. If we had made it, that would not happen in this place. So we hadn't made anything. That's because you can't make it on this. It's like saying we made it to heaven and we're good. It's like once saved, always saved from racism. There's no once saved, always saved from racism. There's no once saved, always saved from whiteness. It is lifelong. This is a lifelong endeavor. We're going to be doing this forever. There's no once saved, always saved. We always got to wake up the next day and face the next challenge, the next temptation, the next evil that's coming down our pike. It just doesn't disappear. You know, we kind of get in this like, it's a progressive version of once saved, always saved. Well, we have a statement on LGBTQ. So what? So what? What do you know about non-binary folks? Yeah. You know? You got a statement on racism? Okay, so what? What do you know about the abolition of policing in prisons? So you have a statement on immigration, right? You know, there's so much more that's going to keep coming down the road. We have to be diligent at doing the work. We have to keep forming and informing ourselves because that's a part of our spiritual responsibility to the work. It's always constant. I think you'll find, too, it'll be interesting to see when we all get back together, the generation of members, I'm calling them a generation, but the generation of members that have joined over the last 5 years, they understand this. Many of them came for social justice as the primary reason they arrived here and why they're here. A sociologist and a linguist from Davidson, who are people of color, are not coming to our church if we're not doing something right. Right? Why would they come if we're not doing something right? You know, and so we have to keep always informing ourselves. They're going to teach us things that we don't have a clue about. Others in our church are continuing. The woman in the story of the church reminded me of a part of my own commitment that I needed to make sure I was intentional about when it comes to the elderly, as those who are also marginalized. I can be instructed by you all. You all can teach me and inform me of how we need to grow in our work of justice and spirituality. That's what it means to be on a journey together. It really does, you know. But if the journey is like, no, I don't like that, that doesn't really feel like we're all trying together. If the journey is, no, look, we could be doing it better here. We could actually be more inclusive here, stronger here, more just here, more faithful here, then that's what it means to look like. And we should all be ready to hear that from each other as we try to do this work.
Thank you, Ben. We have time for 1 or 2 short questions. If you have any in the audience, in the congregation, I will come to you with the mic. I'll come with the mic just so people can hear you online.
I'm thinking about the tradition we have with children. And I'm wondering if you're hearing what's happening around the country in progressive churches like ours. How do we bring in the children? And everything we're doing here is just, my heart is filled with joy about where we're heading. But I really worry about my little grandsons and where they're fitting into this. And I'm excited to hear about the change, about maybe how we're going to be doing Sunday school, or what is religious education looking like, and what is happening out there with all of that. Because my heart is breaking for kids and their place in this. And here we're doing these marvelous, marvelous things, but I know that if kids don't want to come to Sunday school, or whatever that looks like, parents get worn down.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And so there's this missing part. What is happening out there in the world? I'm not just saying our church. I'm just saying what's happening. Do we know? Are we addressing that?
Yeah.
And we've got a lot to work on. But I'm hearing we need all the support in the world for Carrie and everything she's trying to do here in that way.
Great question. Thank you, Sharon. Yes. So, a couple things on that one. Obviously, Sharon, you're pointing at some trends that are challenging with bringing young people into a church, especially young people with children, right? The generation that has children right now is the very generation that the church has lost, right? So it's more and more challenging than ever to find ways to connect with parents and their kids. I will tell you this. One thing we are hearing right now is that there is a matter of triaging priorities with children, and because there is no vaccination for under 12, we hear from parents, and I saw some of them here today, that this is the only place they feel safe to bring their kids and anywhere right now. They won't bring them anywhere else but here because of how strict we've been on COVID and how serious we've had the protocols. You know, all the other churches in the neighborhood have now gone back to masking, you know, and are considering creating vaccination mandates for all their staff. We've stayed with masks the whole time, you know. So parents have felt a sense of comfort and connection, those who were already in the community. Now, as far as recruiting the next generation, I mean, I think we're going to have to get out of COVID to see where we really are. I don't know if we'll ever, you know, get out of COVID, but I mean, we got to get to a place where people feel like they can come back to a building together. Last year, before COVID, we had some of the most successful Wednesday night programmings that we were ever having. There were 70 people on Wednesday nights, and children eating together with senior adults. Intergenerational fellowship was being created. It was beautiful. And then COVID hit. Same thing with the marketing campaign. The marketing campaign was appealing to young people who were before the age of when they would have children, you know, really young couples. And that was connecting with them, and they would come, and yet then the marketing campaign got stilted because of COVID. So we were doing the kinds of things that you're talking about to try to connect with the younger generation, and then a lot of it got stunted by COVID. So what we need to do is continue trying to bring it along and bring it back as we move out. And then when we get back to a place where we can do more, we're really going to have to go like gangbusters to try to connect with the folks who, you know, people are feeling a lack of community regardless, you know, even if they're still going out and doing everything. Things have changed out there in the world. So there's a lot of work that we do. But, you know, you mentioned the change in faith formation time. That came to us as a suggestion from young families, that their kids are already up at the crack of dawn yelling and screaming. Why can't they get them to church earlier, you know? So the moving up of the worship time and the moving of faith formation to a different time after worship, all of that came to us from the Barriers to Worship Task Force, from interviews with young families and their children, and all the focus around that to try to make it easier, right, to try to take down barriers and make it easier for families to come to church and to participate. So, you know, it's always experimental. Maybe we'll get in the fall and find out people wanted to sleep in and didn't want to do that, and then we'll have there's nothing we've done yet that we can't take back, right? So, I mean, I think we're just experimenting and trying to find new ways to connect with people, and we'll keep doing that, Sharon. But I appreciate your question on that.
One more quick thing. Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to know how do you convince people who say they want to move forward, who claim they want to be anti-racist or inclusive, how do you convince them to do the work involved? Because there's a lot of lip service, like, okay, I'm a member of a church that's all-inclusive, or says, you know, okay, and I've checked that box off. How do you actually convince them to do the work and to understand that checking a box is not doing it? That you really do have to do the work, like you were saying, every day, look at things, study, educate yourself, talk to people. How do you convince them that checking the box is not enough?
Great question. First, I mean, it's so pervasive and so easy to slip in, for white people, to slip back in the comfort of denial. that we're facing a psychological and pathological problem that is very challenging. So much easier to live in denial than to deal with the reality of racial violence and oppression. And so when you're trying to bring someone out of denial, you almost have to imagine, and you are in many ways, working with someone who has been pathologically determined to think about the world in a particular way, including themselves and their own lives, which means patience and grace in some cases, firmness, but patience and grace. And so the way I think about it is, like you're talking to somebody who is an addict. I recently wrote an article about, some of you have seen it, I'm addicted to whiteness. Whiteness is an addiction because it's something that it's a lie, but it's a lie that we consume over and over and over again as white people from the time we're born until we get older, to the point we're so addicted to it we can't separate ourselves from it or live without it. And so we have to be broken of that addiction. We have to go to AA. We have to get into treatment. We have to do the work. So how do you deal with an addict who's not in recovery? They have to hit rock bottom. And you hit rock bottom when you come to a point where you realize that the racism in your heart is eating you alive as well and killing you as well. And you can appeal to people's self-interest. I know that sounds really selfish and disgusting and basic, but sometimes that's where it is. Racism is hurting white people also. This is something we don't recognize. In addition to the economic and political and power privilege that it offers white people, it steals our humanity. It's stolen our humanity, dehumanizes us. It steals our souls. And in the words of Jesus, it directs our hearts in the wrong places. That's just the spiritual side. Economically, our whiteness, our addiction to whiteness is destroying our own economic security net for white people. White people are voting against their own economic interests all over the country out of a connection to whiteness instead of a connection in solidarity to those in their economic class, for instance. And so we have to, there's a book all of us, some of you I know are reading, about how racist policies have hurt white people as much as it has hurt people of color. And I think if we can continue to show white people how racism is impacting us spiritually as well as, obviously oppressing and hurting other people, sometimes, as sad as it is, you just have to appeal to people's basic self-interest. Try to show them the ways that their lives have been. It's back to when people used to say, the reason I don't like racism is because I really love my black neighbor. And while there's problems with that sometimes of proximity, our lives are less rich when they're segregated. Our lives are distorted and anemic when we are segregated. So are our souls, so are our hearts, so are our spirits, and so are we as a nation economically and politically when we are stuck in this racist cycle. So I guess I would start with appealing to people's self-interest and then not trying to imagine that we can save everybody until they hit rock bottom. Can't save people until they hit rock bottom on this.
I want to add to that, Ben, what we talked about on the podcast that came out on Thursday is that homophobia and transphobia affect us too. And when you're looking at some of the policies that were put in place at the Olympics, that's all rooted in misogyny, right? And so we can't say, I check a box, I go to an affirming church, and then be neutral in the case of transphobia in sports and in other ways that homophobia is enacted in our society. So we have to always be doing the work of, this is a universal issue that's connected to really one or two sources that affect all of us. And so
that's right.
We have one more question. I don't want to forget this person.
Okay.
And then we'll be done for the day. Have you considered using more stories about congregation members to remove some of the unknowns? Highlight the beauty and differences through engaging stories.
Yeah. I think I have in the last couple of weeks. I told a story a couple of weeks ago of a congregation member who called me and said, we're going to have to cut our pledge, and I said, why? And it was because we want to pay our workers more money. And I said, that's not bad news, that's good news. Yeah. That's good news. And so that story, and I think today the story of a woman from Southminster, who told me, don't forget about the elderly being marginalized and treated unjustly. I think that is pretty obvious. COVID has exacerbated injustice toward the elderly in our society. We have our own Corbin, as I've mentioned. We need Medicaid expansion. I don't want to get on a political rant, but we need Medicaid expansion, in North Carolina. So we've got to be thinking about, if we're committed to justice, then we're committed for justice for all. What did King say? Injustice anywhere toward anyone is injustice everywhere toward everyone.
Yeah.
So we got to be about all the injustice. And so I think I'll continue to try to use those stories of members who have communicated to me with something that I think is really important for the whole broader congregation to hear.
Yeah, I think storytelling is so important, and the more we were able to gather and actually be in community with each other, to actually listen and hear each other's stories in a more intimate setting, I think the better that will be as well, to get to know people. Yep. That is all for Talkback today. Thank you all for joining us online and in person.
Appreciate
we hope
you.
to see you next week.